Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final webinar on climate change learning and action. This is part of the Climate Change Learning series for Educator. For those who joined us last week, welcome back. We're grateful to the many educators who have taken time to be here tonight. This event series is hosted by the School of Education at the University of Colorado Boulder. Our generous co-sponsors include the CU Museum of Natural History, the Environmental Studies Department, and the Office of Outreach and Engagement. My name is Kelsey Tayne, and I'm a faculty fellow with the School of Education at CU Boulder. I'm here with Dan Liston, Professor Emeritus of the School of Education, and we're your hosts for tonight's event. We're also joined by Kim Strong and Anna Noble, doctoral students of the School of Education, who are helping us run this event. You might receive chat messages from them. We also want to let you know, for educators and researchers who are local to Colorado, we have several spaces open at our in-person gathering that's this weekend, September 11th and 12th at the University of Colorado Boulder. Our small in-person event will feature amazing speakers, including one here tonight, workshops, and free lunch. Contact me at kelseytayne@colorado.edu for more information or to register, and we'll put my email in the chat. Tonight, we're joined by three fantastic speakers. Each of our speakers will share a 15-minute presentation, and following presentations, we'll all come together for a 30-minute Q&A discussion. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to post your questions into the Q&A box that's located along the bottom tab of your screen. In order for us to effectively read and answer questions, we just ask that you keep your question to a sentence or two. If you have a question for a particular speaker, you can note that in your question as well. Any technical questions or concerns that arise during the webinar, you can post a question or send us a message in the chat, and Kim or Anna will try and support you. So our speakers tonight will consider climate change learning and action. Climate change is a grand challenge of social and ecological injustice. From individual behavior change to collective social action, action across multiple scales is critical for us to work towards just sustainability, marked by living within ecosystem limits, equity, and quality of life for present and future generations. Necessary actions range from transformation at the level of individuals, families, and households to large-scale transformation, such as international agreements and overhauling energy systems, and everything in between. Addressing climate change ethically requires us to recognize and challenge the exploitative relationships between and among humans and nature that are the hallmark of capitalism and colonialism, and instead reimagine how humans relate to each other, other living beings, and the environment. Green technology, while important, is not enough to fix the deep inequities and social and ecological violence of our current system and culture. Neoliberalism and other forms of ecological and social harm are intertwined with proposed pathways to transitioning to renewable energy and zero carbon futures. We need to work towards infrastructure and policy that explicitly addresses inequities, including but not limited to economic, food, and land security through pathways of redistribution, reparations, tribal rights, and more. We must explore and imagine different possibilities for paradigms that have a more just climate future, rooted in indigenous knowledge systems, socio-ecological sustainability, and anti-oppression. Adding to the complexities of acting on climate change is the fact that climate change is a political and politicized issue. Climate change is political because it's policy relevant and something around which people can and do organize. How these challenges are addressed at a policy level is deeply consequential for humans and non-humans, and those in power frequently skirt responsibility for meaningfully addressing these issues. These challenges are also politicized. They're polarizing, contentious, and intertwined with ideology. This is arguably more evident now than ever. But adolescents around the world are thinking about climate change and working to create more just and sustainable futures. Youth are making sense of how to act on these issues as they engage in family conversations, social movements focused on climate action, debate online, and in school classrooms. But we must also consider the hopelessness that many young people experience in the face of these challenges. It's critical that climate change education supports young people's hope and agency to take action towards creating a more just present and future. Teachers, informal educators, and youth organizers can help adolescents grapple with the complexities of climate injustice and help equip youth of all ages with tools and knowledge to act towards climate justice across multiple scales.
I'm Dan, and tonight we have three excellent speakers. All three here to help us consider the challenges and the possibilities in supporting action within climate change, teaching and learning. First, we'll be joined by Professor Clint Carroll. For his webinar presentation, Carroll will discuss some key issues Indigenous nations face when confronting the effects of climate change on their lands, their waters, and more than human relatives, including plants and animals. He will draw from his community-based research with Cherokee people in Oklahoma, as well as other important work in Indigenous climate justice, to highlight some approaches and some strategies that Native people are employing to address the negative impacts that climate change brings to their health and land-based cultures and ways of life. Next, we'll hear from Professor Ramon Gabrieloff-Parish, who will speak to us on the coming of age in the age of climate catastrophe. I'm going to say that again because I kind of tripped over it, and I shouldn't trip over that at all. It's a very powerful title. Coming of age in the age of climate catastrophe. His talk will address challenges young people face with the triple and epidemics of COVID, social injustice, and ecological collapse. He will attempt to address how the classroom can incorporate ritual, contemplation, and initiation to grow citizens able to engage our historical moment. Finally, we have high school teacher Tim Swinehart, who will focus on encouraging student action and student activism. He will discuss the importance of building stories of activism and social movements into curriculum, so that students recognize the incredible diversity of people working for social transformation in response to the climate crisis, and can subsequently begin to see themselves as participants within this work. He'll also talk about how he's encouraged the students in his environmental justice class over the last 6 years to identify action opportunities, both within their school and the broader community, and the ways in which they partnered with community organizers to amplify students' voices, from testifying on climate policies at City Hall to organizing student climate strikes.
So first up is Clint Carroll, Associate Professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. A citizen of the Cherokee Nation, he works at the intersection of Indigenous studies, anthropology, and political ecology, with an emphasis on Cherokee environmental governance and land-based resurgence. Currently, he is working with Cherokee elders, students, and Cherokee Nation staff on an integrated education and research project that investigates Cherokee access to wild plants in northeastern Oklahoma amid shifting climate conditions and fractionated tribal lands. Funded by the National Science Foundation and the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, this work aims to advance methods and strategies for Indigenous land education and community-based conservation.
Wado, thank you, Kelsey, for that introduction. Wado, Dan, thank you all for being here. And thanks for having me. Let me transition here with a screen share. Let's see. All right. Osio Negatawo. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you today and to present alongside Ramon and Tim. I'm coming to you from what's currently known as Longmont, Colorado, the ancestral homelands of Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that will follow among us as panelists, but of course with the Q&A from everyone participating. So I hope this presentation will give you a sense of where I'm coming from as a scholar and educator myself. The way I've organized the talk is first to frame how I think about my work conceptually, which includes drawing on the work of other scholars in the field. So I have a couple of quotes that I'd like to, for us all to kind of sit with and think through. But from there, I'll talk more specifically about the land-based education program that I've co-developed with Cherokee elders and students in Oklahoma. I'll conclude with a few big picture remarks that may serve as springboards for later discussion. And so just before I get started, these photographs here on the title slide are of American ginseng. It's a very valuable medicinal plant for Cherokee people. It's being revitalized. These are photos that I took in 2008 of a project that I was a part of through the Cherokee Nation Natural Resources Department to propagate this plant where it hadn't grown or it hadn't been able to be found by Cherokee people for quite some time. So that's a picture of ginseng, the root in the top right, and then the aerial parts there growing in the center photo. And these are all just to kind of represent some of the land-based work that I do, not only through the tribal government and natural resources office, but also how we've been incorporating younger people into these initiatives that are guided by the knowledge and wisdom of our elders, but that are designed to perpetuate that knowledge and our relationships to plants and animals among future generations. So to get started, this term, let's see, here we go. This term here, the Anthropocene, has really taken up a lot of space over the past few years in environmental studies, geography, and anthropology, all fields that I'm affiliated with, although I'm primarily a scholar of Native American studies. But it attempts to articulate one way to describe our current global geological era, marked by the extensive and long-term impacts of detrimental human activities on the vital systems of the planet. And yet this blanket notion of the human as a singular category has really come to elide the experiences of many people on the planet, specifically indigenous peoples, communities of color, and poor communities who face the most risks from the effects of climate change, even while these populations are often the least responsible for setting this change in motion. Phenomenon that I refer to as the paradox of vulnerability. So I want to next just read a couple of passages from other Indigenous scholars by way of unsettling this blanket use of the Anthropocene when referring to our modern age. And the first one here is by a Potawatomi scholar named Kyle White. The citation is there if you're interested in reading the whole piece. But he writes, the environmental impacts of settler colonialism mean that quite a few indigenous peoples in North America are no longer able to relate locally to many of the plants and animals that are significant to them. In the Anthropocene then, some indigenous peoples already inhabit what our ancestors would have likely characterized as a dystopian future. So we consider the future from what we believe is already a dystopia. And then next, to quote Yuchi Muskogee Creek scholar Daniel Wildcat, he writes, I get angry when I think about global warming. I get angry because I know the history of involuntary removals and relocations indigenous peoples throughout the United States and around the world have endured. So when I began hearing the reports of indigenous displacement as a result of climate change, I got angry. I thought, here we go again, another removal of indigenous peoples. And so with those quotes and kind of this critical take on the Anthropocene, or at least the use of the anthro as the anthropos as a blanket term for all humans, I would like to propose another way of referring to our modern age or our current era as the colonial scene. And really to just emphasize that climate change and colonialism are two sides of the same coin. They both entail the past and present disruption of relationships between humans and the earth. And for Indigenous peoples, reacting to the colonial scene is fundamentally about restoring, reclaiming, and protecting these relationships. And so under this broad banner of Indigenous resurgence, these types of actions can take many forms, and they include land-based activism and land reclamation, often, at least currently, under the banner of the hashtag #LandBack. Multi-level or multi-scalar advocacy and policy work, for example, on regional and global scales. And then land education and community-based resurgence projects, which is what I will be talking about mostly today through the project, the program in Oklahoma with Cherokee elders and students. And I just want to stress that, well, first of all, these 3 bullets here, they don't encompass everything when we think about Indigenous resurgence, all the other possibilities there are, the other programs and projects that Indigenous communities are working on, but also that I view them as all related, intertwined, and in relation to one another. So thinking of this in terms of a relational activist framework. Some of them are more inward looking, some of them are more outward looking, but they're all in conversation with one another. So the program that we've designed as a result of the NSF work, the NSF grant that we're funded through, is called the Cherokee Environmental Leadership Program. And some goals and really the scope of the program is that it fundamentally centers Cherokee knowledge and language. And it includes Western science, but only when applicable. So there's a sense of privileging and prioritizing Cherokee ways of knowing. It also includes relevant tribal policy and land management issues. We work very closely in partnership with our Secretary of Natural Resources Office. And then as a product of it being a project funded by the National Science Foundation, it does entail a research component, which is community-based. And we work with 3 different communities in the Cherokee Nation to understand issues of access to plants and access to lands for perpetuating these land-based practices. And so the students who are a part of it, we have 5 Cherokee students who are currently a part of this, also get experience in community-based research, working with those communities. The overall goal of this program is to build a cohort of tribal environmental leaders who can take on the issues we face using these approaches. And so it's a 3-year pilot program. COVID has absolutely interrupted our activities. It's really just something that we can't really get beyond because our work is with elders, and that's certainly a population for Indigenous communities, I think, especially in terms of language keepers, knowledge keepers, who we are at that high risk and we don't want to endanger. So we've been stalled lately, unfortunately. But this began in September of 2018, and it's built upon the past work that I've been doing collaboratively and the ongoing relationships that I've been cultivating with the Cherokee Medicine Keepers. It's a small group of elders in Oklahoma, all fluent Cherokee speakers who were raised with land-based knowledge. And as Kelsey said, this is funded jointly through the National Science Foundation and the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. But a little bit about the Medicine Keepers. They formed in 2008, and they actually serve as an advisory council to the Cherokee Nation Secretary of Natural Resources on ethnobiological issues, so on cultural knowledge of plants, animals, and the land. And their mission is to perpetuate Cherokee knowledge of wild plants and to preserve the health of Cherokee lands for the benefit of present and future generations. And so just to highlight one of our medicine keepers through this quote, which really embodies a lot of the program. I'll talk a little bit more about the guiding principles, but he said, we were always told you come from the land and everything you need comes from the land. It's your fault if you go hungry. And what this says to me is that as someone who, again, was raised with land-based knowledge, his parents were imparting upon him the notion that you're connected to the land, but also that the land provides for you. And there's a relationship there, inherent relationship. And if you know how to nurture that relationship, then that's how you survive as a Cherokee person. And so I'll flip through a few slides just to kind of show you some examples of what we do. But we have 3 group meetings per year centered around land-based activities. This one here shows Anna Sixkiller to the right in the black jacket, cracking open, teaching our students how to crack open hickory nuts to make a traditional dish called ganache. And this is actually taking place at the land on which we conduct our activities that has been specifically set aside for cultural purposes as a conservation area by the Cherokee Nation. So it's a really significant place and a special place for what we're doing, and for all the wonderful plants and animals that reside there. A lot of them are very important food and medicine plants. But throughout the year, I also conduct online meetings with our students. We study the language. Again, language is central to our efforts. And then they have individual mentor projects with their mentor elders. So they're paired up with elders, and they work on things as kind of an ongoing thing throughout the course of this pilot program. They also have field outings with tribal cultural biologists, again, learning from knowledge that is more centered in Western biology, but still is appropriate at times. And then they work in the heirloom crop and medicine gardens at the tribal capital in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And then, as I alluded to with this tract of land that we see here, they're involved in larger efforts for conserving more additional tracts of tribal land throughout northeastern Oklahoma. And so, throughout our meetings, we'll have impromptu, I guess you could say, side lessons where elders will, find a plant and teach the students about its properties and what it's been used for, its importance for Cherokee people. So this was at the same meeting in which we were learning from the elders how to make the traditional dish from hickory nuts. And then, most of our our meetings take place outdoors and around a fire as a way to kind of center everybody. And so I'll just flip through because I know I'm running short on time. It's a picture of our junior member, Cherokee Davis, who's holding a transplant of a willow, specific willow, dwarf prairie willow, that is a highly valued medicinal plant. We were transplanting onto that tract of land where we have our meetings. Impromptu meetings from elders. This was a chance for folks to come indoors on a hot summer day. Crosland Smith here is a highly renowned spiritual leader of the Cherokee Nation. He's teaching the students about some sacred Cherokee symbology. And then John Ross here teaching students about the wild cherry bark used for coughs and cough medicine. And so this is an example of one of the elder mentor projects that I mentioned earlier, where one of our students, Kylie Workman, designed a pamphlet, a booklet on how to say certain words when you're out in the woods with a fluent speaker. So really a language guide that was connected to environmental knowledge and the language that you would use out in the woods. Just wrapping up, this is an image of our curriculum development workshop, which again, is not under fluorescent lights in a boardroom, but was rather around a fire outdoors, talking about what would such a program look like and how would the elders envision enacting something that was based in Cherokee knowledge, and that often invoked feelings and expressions about their experiences in Indian boarding schools, which was designed to do the exact opposite, extract and remove that knowledge, that traditional knowledge and the Cherokee language from them. And so they came up with 4 guiding principles, and I'll have to rush through these to give my co-presenters plenty of time here, but these really embody what they came up with when it came to understanding Cherokee education, if you will. So building a strong relationship to the land, Nigada Gust Di Dadada Ni, which is we are all related to each other, but also to the natural world. Teaching by showing, and then learning by doing, so experiential education, if you will. So Squeo Haskell, which is a way to say teach me, but really means show me. Communalism and interdependence, Skino Gigaweska, if we work together, we'll get somewhere. And then having a good time, Ali Haley Gidas, enjoyment. And so putting this all in a bigger picture, in thinking about this in terms of what this can say outside of Cherokee communities, outside of the Cherokee Nation. And it's this term governance value, borrowing again from Kyle White. And this is a way of saying that land-based Indigenous practices, activism, and advocacy have implications for environmental governance, broadly speaking. These implications reside in the ethical and relational frameworks that guide them. In turn, this compels us as educators to prepare our students for working with Indigenous nations. And my concluding point is that climate change education needs to include and support Indigenous studies and, by extension, ethnic studies education. So thinking about this as opportunities for coalitional work and policy work. So I'll leave you with this image here again of this beautiful tract of land where we practice our educational activities. And I'll just say thank you. Wadon.
Oh, thank you, Clint. Excuse me. I was struck from listening to Clint's talk about a number of things. Some of his quotes in the very beginning seemed to have me turning my head at least 180 degrees, if not 360 degrees, and landing somewhere else. And reminded me of my early youth as an intellectual with reading Herbert Marcuse and Jürgen Habermas. And this is different stuff here, and it is having the same effect on me. And I guess I just want to underscore, I don't want to, I'll have all the, I mean, there's this notion of the paradox of vulnerability is a really, I think, a really, really powerful one. And then what I got from Clint's talk was this notion of this understanding of the role of indigenous land-based knowledge and the connective threads that can be woven. In some sense, I think that can help with that what we see as a growing sense of despair, but it ain't gonna get rid of it, in some sense too. So Clint, thank you very, very, very much. Look forward to conversations that we'll have later on. Thank you. Now, so next up, we're going to hear from Ramon Gabrieloff-Parish, an assistant professor of interdisciplinary studies at Naropa University, where he teaches courses in food and environmental justice, as well as foundations in diversity and sustainability. He also serves as board chair for Frontline Farming, a women and global majority lead farmer advocacy organization, as well as working for the revival of rites of passage and life transition ceremonies with organizations such as Golden Bridge and Youth Passageways. So, Ramon, I hand it off to you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, so let me start the screen share. So, you can see that. Come on. Okay. So when Kelsey asked us to send our topics, I just came up with this: coming of age in the age of climate catastrophe. And then I thought to myself, once I wrote the description, well, actually, do I know anything about this? And do I even have anything to say on this? And one of the first things that occurred to me is just some conversations that I've had with my own kids. And the person you see in the center is my eldest daughter. And she is eating pomegranates, and she calls this picture a new take on Persephone. And I don't know, maybe y'all know that kind of Greek story of the Earth daughter who was abducted into the underworld. And so I really got to thinking, like, wow, like, what does she mean by that, you know? So, you know, she was home. She's studying marine biology in college right now, and she was home for a year for COVID. And we had a lot of long talks into the night. And one of the things that came up is she said to me, or they said to me, that we have to, meaning their generation, have to grow up and like come of age anyway. We've got to grow up, and that's already ordeal enough. But coming up and coming of age and becoming an adult in a world where you know that we're going to be dealing with, you know, one climate shock after another, you know, one destabilizing event after another. I mean, they're happening right now, right? On both coasts. And just the really deep anxiety and dread that induces. And, you know, we talk a lot about climate change. People use this phrase existential threat, like on repeat now. And, you know, I look at that word existential, and it isn't just our life. It's kind of like the philosophical sense of like, why even live in the first place? And I think that a lot of the young people who are coming of age now are facing this question of, why should I even hang on to my life when we know we're in for hardship? And that a lot of people around the world are already experiencing it. And so there's this really big question: why should we live, and what for? And I think whenever you're thinking big, you know, you're thinking mythically. You're speaking beyond logic. You're speaking beyond common sense, and you're dealing with the mythic level of things. So this is a quote by Michael Meade, who's a storyteller and kind of like kind of street mythologist who works a lot with young people from different backgrounds. And his quote says, "Something deep in the human soul awakes as things fall apart. Something in the soul knows that everything in this world can become lost, and something in the soul knows how to survive periods of devastation, disorientation, and loss. Descent and falling is the way of the soul from its beginning. We each fell from the womb of life when the waters of the inner sea broke, and it came time for us to breathe on our own." And I got another here by Paul Hawken, and I'm not going to read it in total, but you know, he says, "We are at the beginning of a mythic period of existence, rather like the age portrayed in the Bhagavad Gita or in other ancient tales of light and darkness. We live in a time where every living system on Earth is in decline, and the rate of decline is accelerating as our economy grows. The very practices that bring us the goods and services we desire are destroying the Earth," and I would add, people as well. "To feel the momentum of loss is to want to close one's eyes, yet to close one's eyes is to do the very thing that will bring forth the fruits of ignorance. I believe in rain and odd miracles and the intelligence that allows terns and swallows to find their way across the earth. And I believe we are capable of creating a remarkable future for humankind." So, you know, these two are kind of putting forth that there's something in us that knows how to survive and even how to transform, and that we are facing these sort of mythic scale monsters, and they're monsters of our own creation, you know? And so, you know, we've at least have the twin crises of social inequity and climate catastrophe, and it's really probably a hydra. It's probably got 9 heads instead of 2, but I just kind of, you know, just indicating what is really up in people's faces right now. So how does this generation deal with a lot of it? I mean, the same way that a lot of generations do, but you know, my eldest says, you know, we're almost like it's like Dada, it's like nihilistic art and humor that they put out there. And I don't know if you all see any of these memes, or if you've seen any of these memes, but you know, the one on the bottom, Boomer, it says, Boomer, your generation does not know how to dress. It says, Boomer, what about those holes in your pants? Did you make those yourself? And then Gen Z kid says, what about those holes in the ozone you made yourself, right? And Boomer's shocked. So like this kind of like really dark, like apocalyptic and like numbed out humor is very common, and it's very potent, and it's starting at a young age because the kids really are feeling this in a way that I think we've been feeling it for a while, but it's accelerated. And it leads to this kind of the stress and this anxiety. And you know, there was a study done, I'm forgetting what university, out of California in 2014, that found that the incoming class of freshmen was the most reported the highest levels of depression and anxiety. And that's just, and since the study started 50 years ago, and that's just one indicator, but the signs are all around us. It's cumulative, the stress, and it hits on some communities harder than others. So all of that, I feel, takes us to this question about rites of passage, right? That's the topic of my talk, rites of passage and just sustainabilities and the education for just sustainability. And it takes us really to this phenomenon of initiation. And there's a lot of ways to look at it. There are a lot of cultural traditions and non-traditions about it. But basically, one way you could say we could talk about initiation is you undergo an experience that is shattering or deeply challenging or very heavy or revelatory or something. And initiatory experiences are experiences that life will bring to us naturally, but in many cultural traditions around the world, especially before the advent of colonialism and the industrial growth society, people had intelligence to actually host the initiation for their youth. Okay, and so the term that's come to us is rites of passage. And there are a lot of different ways of looking at it. This image here is a map of, it incorporates a kind of anthropology way of looking at it, and also Naropa University's kind of Buddhist mindfulness-based way of looking at it, okay? And some people put it linear and some people not, but basically some of the elements. The first is a kind of separation, right? Like you get broken off from your everyday life and pushed out into something that is where you can't come back from, okay? And another way of saying this in the Buddhist language is not knowing. You give up trying to understand. You give up trying to encompass, and you really have to fall into the face of the unknown. And then you can go to the threshold of bearing witness. And one way to look at the threshold is that's the kind of initiatory experiences. That's when you are out in the wilderness by yourself, or where you have to dance all night, or where you are in a tent clustered with your peers and you're stuck there and like you lose your name and that kind of stuff. And it's like basically your identity is stripped and you have a raw encounter with reality. And the Buddhist term is bearing witness. You know, you have to see it, you have to take it in, no matter how terrible. And then the last one, and again, the map kind of shows it as nonlinear, is incorporation. When you come back into your community, ideally with some type of having been marked somehow or another by your experience and having been awakened. And at that point, you potentially, first of all, oftentimes traditionally were then recognized as somebody who could carry the weight of adulthood. And second, as somebody who could be, you know, heal others or serve others. And so if we're educators, part of what we are training people to do ideally is serve others and be there for others. And if we're talking about climate change, if we're talking about racism, if we're talking about, you know, all of them, we have to step in and act and offer energy. So that the idea is that rites of passage in an educational context can help us get to the rawest parts of ourselves and come with our full selves in our service. So running out of time here, but I do want to touch on Joanna Macy as someone who has, in sort of contemporary, and I'll go ahead and just say in culturally white spaces, has done a lot of work to help folks face the grief and despair that comes from knowing that we actually have the capacity to really severely mutilate the earth and ourselves. And one of the things that oftentimes you hear amongst the people of the millennial and Gen Z generations is, no one else has faced this but us. And Macy says, I grew up in the era of the dropping of the atomic bomb. And we really were concretely faced with the fact that humans could bring the myth of apocalypse into reality. And I want to build off of what Clint was saying. It's not all humans, it's particular groups of humanity have these weapons and kind of lord them over the rest of us with them. So Joanna Macy's work focuses on how do we build practices that help us actually face the despair and actually recognize that there's a resource and a power, and that our full power as people comes from these really heavy, supposedly dark emotions. So these are just some of the images of the maps that she works with. And the one on the right is just me kind of trying to think out, like, how do we work with, incorporate rites of passage and other ritual practices into our work as environmental and social justice educators? We got to give people information, but information is not enough. And sometimes it's too much these days. And we rely so much on giving them the bad news and the bad news and the bad news. It's overwhelming. So we got to work with, where's the emotional life? How's the emotional body deal with it, right? And then from our emotions, we can come at inspiration. We can start to arrive at a place where something lights up inside of us, or something fills us up and takes us into action. And then once we are acting, then we're in a space where we can start to look at what was the effectiveness of our action. Okay, so here are just a lot of points about how we can incorporate ritual into and rites of passage into environmental, ecological, social justice-based education. And I don't have time to cover all of them, but I'm going to focus on a few just really quickly. I think one thing to help this current generation is help them to recognize that they are not alone in this struggle, and that they have ancestors, that this struggle is multi-generational, and it's been going on for decades, if not centuries, and that there are eco-warriors and social eco-justice warriors that have carried the torch and done a lot of work for us to be at the place where we are now. We've got Chief Niwot here, who in the landscape of Boulder County really tried to protect his people and talk some sense into the white settlers before he was massacred. We got George Washington Carver, who we all know is the gentleman who created 1,000 Uses for Peanuts, but he was also a mystic, and he was also an advocate for Black people relating to land, and relating to land in a way that was not forced, because previous to that, in our experience, our relationship to land in this part of the world was forced. Wangari Maathai, I don't think I need to speak about Wangari Maathai, but just as a recently gone ancestor. And just this fact that, like, that strength, that ancestral power actually is in us, and it's been passed down to us, and it's our work, it's the work of each generation to pick it up. And it's not their work to complete it. And that's another anxiety that I think a lot of the millennials and Gen Z folks are facing, is feeling that they have to do it all. Ritual, ceremony. Here, the thing I want to say is, ritual is a big question, and it might be sketchy in the public school context, but the main thing I want to say here is you enact symbolism. Find ways to embody and enact symbolism. This is a picture of me and a few other folks in a program called Surfing the Creative, which is a local Boulder initiative. And we were doing this thing called Council of All Beings. We're trying to speak for different parts of the earth. And so we were literally earth and stone. We covered ourselves in mud, and we moved very slowly. So creating living symbols, or accessing and researching living symbols from your cultural traditions. Embodiment, somatics, coming to our senses. Okay, the emotions that we're feeling about climate change have physical impacts and corollaries, and we can start to work with them on that level. You can't just talk to people, you can't just feel, you actually have to work on the level of the body. This is also from Surfing the Creative. This is led by a somatic spiritual educator in town, Melissa Michaels, and just really getting youth to like move out and express a lot of this tension that's living in them and anxiety that's living in them, in part because that movement is the prelude to action. All right, and then finally I had at the bottom there, we need other cultural imaginations. The cultural imagination that created the climate crisis, that even created the concept of the Anthropocene, I don't think that cultural imagination has, it hasn't eaten its experience enough to envision something different. So Afrofuturism as one way of an alternate cultural imagination for projecting forward into the future. But mainly what I'm saying here is that another piece here is working with the imagination, working with art, symbol, imagination. And I don't have time to read that quote. I'm just gonna keep on moving. So this last image is just really to just get your imagination sparkling, y'all, and to recognize that the kids who are growing up and each generation is really, I believe, imbued with particular forms of imagination that can help them take the next steps. And I think that we even have the ability to like imagine how we navigate our way through this mess that we've created. And just as a closer, here are some organizations that I've worked with that are doing this work and could either serve as consultants for y'all or maybe directly helping out in classroom spaces, or who you can just work with or look into. And I would particularly say Youth Passageways as one that that could connect you to a lot of regional rites of passage practitioners and so forth. Okay, thank you all. I know I went a bit over time.
I wasn't timing, Ramon. And that was powerful, powerful, powerful. I heard the other day on the national news, one of our leaders talk about this existential threat, and it just rolled off the tongue. And you're asking us to live in and feel what that existential threat is like and what it means to kids. And then from there, you've developed a connection to the experiences of lots and lots and lots of people through the focus on myth and archetypal stories. I mean, this is a wealth of information and stuff to draw on. So, I mean, in your notion that these mythical grand stories can help people process, understand, come to terms with the emotions that we find ourselves in today. And I think they probably help us to understand that oh, I lost my paradox of vulnerability that Clint was talking about earlier. So thank you very much, Ramon. This is good stuff. Appreciate it. And now I've got to find my text here. Hold on. Huh. Well, hold on just a second. I have misplaced. Here we are. Oh, now we move from Ramon to Tim Swinehart. And we're going to hear from Tim Swinehart, who is a geography and environmental justice teacher at Lincoln High School and also at Lewis and Clark College, both of which are in Portland, Oregon. He received the 2015 Oregon Outstanding Social Studies Teacher of the Year. That's no small feat. And is co-editor of a collection called A People's Curriculum for the Earth, teaching about climate change and the environmental crisis. And he's also a founding member of the Portland Public Schools Climate Justice Committee and has been a member of that since 2016. Tim has led workshops across the US on the need for bold climate justice education, and his work as an environmental justice educator, has been featured in the New York Times, Yes Magazine, and NEA Today. So, Tim, we turn it over to you, and I look forward to your talk. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Swinehart, and calling in tonight from Portland, Oregon. And so I want to acknowledge that the land that I'm calling in from is land that was stolen and is the traditional land of Chinook-speaking people who included bands the Multnomah, Clackamas, and Watwalla, as well as the Kalapuya and Molalla people of the Willamette Valley. And just also want to say that I'm just feeling super honored and humbled to be here in the presence of folks like Clint and Ramon. Yeah, just looking forward to having the chance to all talk a little bit, feeling really inspired by some of the things that they've shared so far. Let me see here. Let me go ahead and get my screen up here. Okay. So, I was thinking about my talk and kind of what I chose to focus on here. And I maybe one of the best ways of putting it would just be that these are the slides, I guess, of a proud teacher, meaning like I'm proud of my students and the work that they've done. And that, I'm sort of just sharing a lot of that work with you as someone who was a collaborator and a co-participant in that work. So they're kind of here with us as well. And I just want to make sure to honor that. I got started teaching about the climate crisis over 15 years ago now, and had a chance to work with a teaching mentor of mine, Bill Bigelow, to put together this volume, People's Curriculum for the Earth, that came out in 2014. And, as we were putting it together, both as social studies, high school social studies teachers, we were really aware that we wanted to kind of move beyond, the focus on climate literacy and the next generation science standards, which are fine, but really kind of are often held up as like the gold standard of climate education, at least in the K-12 world. And I think as Ramon hinted to, so importantly that a lot of times that sort of climate literacy education leaves kids with a knowledge of crisis and then just kind of dumps them there. And, I quickly realized that I had a much bigger responsibility as an educator to help kind of take students on a journey beyond just, knowledge of crisis, but, to one where really what Bill and I were trying to do in this book is to story, both the inequality and injustice of the climate crisis, which I think Clint and Ramon have touched on really eloquently. And we also really wanted to story and tell the stories of the people struggling all across the globe in the work of transformation. And so really like, I feel like anymore, and I just really, so much of what Ramon said, I feel like resonated with me, that I used to feel like my work was kind of to convince students that there was a crisis, like to kind of offer the stories, again, of the people around the world, the most affected by the crisis, having done so little to cause it, and those are still absolutely essential stories. But I think also now that students everywhere essentially are experiencing this crisis in very, visceral ways, right? Like the 2 summers of smoke that we've had here in Portland. A year ago this time, we had some of the worst smoke or some of the worst air quality in the world. And so it's the climate crisis is no longer something that's sort of out there for students. So now it really is, I think that, I feel like my responsibility is to kind of help them see that we actually still have a reason to hope, and that there is, there is a reason to take action and to, work towards collective struggles. So kind of by the way, because I am a classroom teacher and I've have led workshops over the years and have also benefited from workshops myself. I always like to share resources in case there are people, that might be able to take something to the classroom, next week or next month. And so I wanted to make sure folks were aware of the Zen Education Project, which is a social justice oriented history teaching website. And over the last few years, we have kind of developed a Teach Climate Justice project there as well. And so there are a number of classroom tested activities written by teachers, and a couple just that I have helped write include this one called Blockadia. It's a role play kind of telling the stories of the anti-fossil fuel movement around the world, as well as this one that I was just going to talk for a minute about that introduces students to a variety of different climate justice activists. And it's called Meet Today's Climate Justice Activists, a mixer on the people saving the world. Let's see, there we go. And when my colleague Matt Reed and I wrote this particular piece of curriculum a couple of years ago, one, we were really feeling inspired by the global youth movement, and all of the ways that youth activism was really, starting to push the adult world to move faster and more urgently, in response to the climate crisis. And so we wanted to again tell the stories of just this incredible, rich diversity of activism. Both in terms of who's participating, as well as what activism can look like, right? That it can look like art, that it can look like farming, with these first couple examples here, that we highlight a lot of youth activists in this role play. And also just, people in a variety of different circumstances, really like just coming together to do this work of like working for a better world. And I think, it sounds a little cliche, but I think that as a high school teacher, I noticed that students, they don't get these stories when in too many ways before they've come to my classroom. They don't get them in the mainstream media. They don't get them in most of their other classes. They're often not hearing these stories at home. I don't even know that they always get them so much on social media, although, I would hope that they would, but they're really hungry for these stories of people who are fighting, and are working together with other people. And so anyway, I just, that's something that I have really seen students thrive with over the years. So I also wanted to talk just a little bit about the policy, the educational policy that we worked on over the last, I guess it's like 5, 6, 7 years now here in Portland. We passed through our school board what was the first climate justice education policy in the nation. And we really, again, we didn't want it to be only a climate change education policy, but it was really important that it centered climate justice. This language here, I always like to read, just because it is official school district policy in the district where I teach, that all PPS students should develop confidence and passion when it comes to making a positive difference in society, and come to see themselves as activists and leaders for social and environmental justice. And I've had a chance to read that, to folks that are teaching across the country, and very much get, people have said like, well, that's nice for you in Portland, but that is never going to be language, in the place where I teach, right? I get that, and I think that we all kind of have a role to play in just really encouraging students to see themselves as activists. So whether it's school district policy or not, I just really love, this idea that this is part of our responsibility as educators, especially in this moment. And, so a couple of, I just wanted to share a couple of examples. This is kind of that, just, me being a proud teacher, I guess, of what activism as learning has looked like for me over the last few years in this pretty extraordinary opportunity that I've had to teach this environmental justice class, and just the young people that I have had such an incredible honor and privilege to work with. So a few years back, that looked like the whole class taking a field trip to City Hall with art, with student testimony, with a song. That's me playing my guitar there in the corner. And this was all to the mayor of Portland at a point in time where we were wanting to push for a stronger policy to ban future fossil fuel infrastructure. It felt pretty extraordinary to know that we were doing this during class time, during the school day, and that this was the curriculum, right, for this environmental justice class. I think in an age of educational standardization, this is something that really has spoken to me over the years as something that I feel like we do need more of in all the different ways that we can try to figure out how to do that. Let's see, I did skip one here. Okay. It's also looked like this is a collaboration again with various groups here in Portland, including the Braided River Project. But we've been leading these environmental justice tours of the Willamette River for students and teachers for the last few years. And so that's my environmental justice class there in front of a tanker full of tar sands oil at a oil facility that should not exist, given that ban that we were advocating for a few years earlier. And it looks like finally, after years and years of activism, the city might actually be denying their permits to exist in the future. But but again, this is kind of like, we're in this area, and you're not studying about this at a distance. You're smelling the flaring of fossil fuel tanks, and your throat burns, right? And I think that, that's like, it's just there's again sort of a visceral experience that can come from that, that can again sort of lead to to a fire inside, I think, that towards action. And in this experience with this class, a couple of days later, we did happen to have a meeting with the mayor, and I had students that were really taking him to task. They were, some of them were in tears, sort of demanding why and asking why it is that the city wasn't doing more to shut down Zenith, and just having just sharing, really like not taking no for an answer. It was pretty remarkable. And again, just these experiences, I know from having heard from students afterwards just how transformational they can be. Let's see here. Whoops, no. Okay. One more picture in December of 2019, and this is kind of just prior to the pandemic. And I appreciated what Clint said about being involved in a project that the pandemic has kind of put on hold, and that it hurts my heart a little bit to know that is true of a lot of this work with students too, that in some ways was put on hold, but I feel like is maybe starting to pick back up at this point. But so these were students that had helped in collaboration again with community organizations, Sunrise PDX, 350 PDX, and our classroom turned into an organizing hub. And so we had different focus groups, people that were, working on facilities and outreach and connecting with students across the city. And then the day of the event, we had, students acting here as press liaisons and medics. And again, like just to the point, one, I mean, it was just an incredible experience, but again, like this is the curriculum, in this class. And I just, and as a result, this has also become the curriculum in more classes across the district, because, Coalition of Students has helped to to kind of advocate for a broader sort of broader implementation of this type of class. So I think, let's see here. We at 6:38. With permission, I might finish with the words of a student here. I think I'm still just under time. This is just 2 minutes. And this was just, this is the kind of an example of poetry of activism. This is Julia reading, it's a guerrilla poetry reading to our Governor Kate Brown. It wasn't invited, but she got it. And I think it just kind of, it's a really beautiful note to end on. So we'll hope this works.
Of Hurricane Katrina and says we need to wake up because Hurricanes Harvey and Irma are in far too many headlines to ignore.
You know what, I want to stop and ask one of the organizers. I have not checked to see if our audio is working. Can anybody let me know if you can hear that?
I can hear you, or I can hear the audio, yeah.
You could hear Julia speaking? Okay, great.
Because there's flooding in Texas, Florida, Long Island, Puerto Rico. Because in Houston, water drips from broken ceilings like tears. Because in Syria, the only water is the tears streaming down refugees' faces as they are forced to leave their home, the result of a drought-induced civil war. Because Hurricane Katrina was over 10 years ago, and people are still forced to choose whether to rebuild or retreat, because I am reminded that choice is a privilege. Naomi Klein states the scientific facts of climate change allow one to choose how they will react. And many still insist on blatantly disregarding these facts. In 2017, Trump states that climate change research is a waste of money. Trump, I urge you to tell that to Mika Mayava, who wakes up every morning to realize the shoreline of the island he calls home is consistently receding. Tell that to Feifei, a young girl in Beijing who can't leave her house without a pollution mask. Tell that to Danielle, who lives in fear of the Pacific Connector pipeline destroying the river that runs near her home, the river that is her everything. Because we need to wake up. The US pulls out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Wake up. Media commentators speak of compassion fatigue. Since when does compassion have a limit? Wake up. An anti-environmental politician pounds his fist on a table. It shakes. The whole world shakes. Wake up. Because we won't rest until ash ceases to swirl in the sky like raindrops, until the only water rushing is glistening through streams, waterfalls, rivers, oceans, until we shift from caring about paychecks to caring about people, until we can see empathy dripping like honey, swinging from trees, spreading like ice in the Arctic, until we can lay on the earth and let compassion encircle us like a blanket of blue sky. Wow. That's right. Thank you. So
Okay, thank you for indulging me to play that. I'll leave it at that and look forward to conversations with folks.
Well, Tim, thank you very much. And hearing you begin as the to recount the stories of a proud teacher, it seems you should be quite proud. And I've always thought that there are few things better in life than hearing the words and experiences of thoughtful practitioners. And we've had you, and we've also had Clint and Ramon today. And I guess I wish I had a little more time, but I do think that what you're talking about is you're giving voice, you're connecting students to activists and activist organizations, and they are the practitioners of a particular kind of knowledge. And they're helping, I would think, your students in ways that probably could not be had in the classroom. So, and then Julia's testimony at the very end was both a very personal testimony, but also I think almost was reaching into that realm of myth and grand stories, and feeling the pains of the great paradox. So we're gonna move and transition here from our individual speakers, and Kelsey has joined us. Hey, Kelsey. Kelsey has joined us, and we're going to move along to some questions, and hopefully our panelists can join us also too now, and we'll see what gets going. Thank you all.
Yeah, Clint, Ramon, Tim, thank you so much. Those were amazing talks. I feel really grateful to have gotten to listen to them, so thank you. I know we want this to be mostly a conversation, but I figured I could just kind of get us started with a question. So I was struck by how Ramon and Clint foregrounded intergenerational learning and work in their talks. Clint, you talked about the Cherokee communities that you work with focused on learning and knowledge sharing across multiple generations in joyful outdoor spaces. And Ramon, you said something that stuck with me. It was something like it's the work of each generation to pick up, but not necessarily to complete. And Tim, you shared your students pushing adults in City Hall and leading tours of students and teachers. And I wonder how educators might think about this intergenerational teaching and learning and why it matters. And I guess especially for teachers who might work with students who are all in the same age type group, how might they think about this?
Well, while Clint and Ramon are thinking, I'll just maybe jump in just quickly just to say that that actually really stood out to me when Ramon was talking about this too, and I think that that quote about this not being the work of our students to complete is so important, because I think they do have. I hear this from students all the time. That is very much the sense that they have. They feel like they're alone in this. They feel like they've been abandoned by older generations, and I think it also feeds into the narratives. And this comes back to like telling the stories of activism and kind of the multi-generational struggle, because I think because they're wrong, right? They don't see the struggle that has existed, for generations, but, and whether this is kind of fed by some of these memes or whatever else, they are misinformed, I think, when it comes to that. But, I'll have, it's so funny. There's one small example and I'll stop. As I was kind of starting teaching, I would go to environmental events in Portland, and I would kind of look out across the room and I would see all these, heads of gray hair. And I would kind of think as an aspiring teacher, like, well, where are all the like young people, right? And so a couple of years ago, it just really struck me when some students started going to similar events, and they came back to the class and they're like, God, it's amazing. There are all these old people that actually care about this stuff, and I was like, well, okay, so that's really good.
Ramon, do you want to pick it up here, or I'm happy to throw a few words out, but I'm really interested to hear from you if you've got something to say.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think out the question. I don't necessarily have like a pre-prepared like answer, but like, I guess I think like, doing things like starting in the present and then working backwards. So maybe you got Greta now, right? And then you got Julia Butterfly Hill, like in the 90s and early 2000s. And then like who was before that and who did, something similar, you know what I mean? Like, so you start in the present generation with the people that they can connect to or that they know of. And then you say, Greta wasn't the first person to do that though. Who was Greta inspired by? Who first of all, probably her parents. So because I think one of the things that we do in this society, and it's very attractive on a certain level for like TV and electronic culture, is you always think everything has to be recreated, and you feel like you have to do everything originally, but then that creates a lot of stress when you're looking at something that it was caused by generations, and it's going to take generations to I don't even know if fix is the word.
Yeah, that just makes me think about, going back to the quote that I shared about dystopia, and trying to think about what is the work that does for us right now, and thinking about future generations, younger generations. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Ramon, putting that in perspective of generational ancestral knowledge of the apocalypse, basically, and yet here we are, and this may seem apocalyptic, but it's not unique to this generation. And so what are the stories then that surface, right? Then you get stories that push back against despair, as you're alluding to, the stories of triumph, of resilience. And I always think about, this is a tough moment for me when I don't purport to be in the same boat as our school teachers who are dealing with very different issues that I deal with in the classroom. And so that's where I'm a little bit hesitant to offer any kind of definitive answer. But when it comes to issues of despair, I teach a course on environmental issues in Native America, and that despair narrative sometimes gets carried away as far as the way that it lands on the students. We talk about colonialism and really essentially kind of what I briefly covered in my talk, how in climate crisis and colonialism go hand in hand. And that's pretty despairing, disparaging. But there's a great quote that I come back to in that context when it happens. And inevitably, it always happens. And that's by Robin Kimmerer, also a Potawatomi scholar, who kind of comes around to this in her book, Braiding Sweetgrasses. And I hang on this quote: despair is paralysis, and it's not to negate or push away some of the amazing work that I was listening to in your talk, Ramon, and also just kind of being able to sit with it and have to think with it alongside your students, like Tim was talking about. It's not to push away that grief and despair aren't important to really sit with and feel, but at the end of it all, it's paralyzing. And so what are we going to do? And so she comes to this point of saying, restoration work is about restoring relationships, and it's kind of that adage of like, it's never too late to plant a tree. We got to start somewhere, and that's kind of thinking through that type of time, that not the rushed time of crap, we got to do something now. Well, like Tim, you're saying, it's happened and it's happening, and time's run out already. So how are we going to work to restore and repair those relationships among our communities, and then among our communities and the earth? That takes a lot more time, but I think that's much more worthwhile. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, I think if anyone has any kind of topics or something they want to raise and just continue the conversation, please do. I guess that just makes me think of a question we had here about how might educators think about that balance between supporting youth in kind of those concrete, attainable actions and stuff at the scale of like classrooms or short programs, but alongside, like you're saying, the complexities and grand scale of just an ethical action on climate change as an issue of colonialism and capitalism and these kind of this deep issue. So just if anyone has kind of thoughts on that, how teachers and informal educators might navigate that.
just to get clear on the question, the small scale of taking action and the large scale of problem, and like how teachers navigate that, is that?
Yeah, kind of the desire to support young people in taking kind of concrete and attainable type action. And maybe I'm thinking about especially going into like working with younger kids too, but also knowing that these are, like you're saying, huge, long problems. How can educators kind of think about that? I guess that dilemma maybe.
I'll jump in again. Clint and Ramon, I think, are offering considerably more thoughtful answers than I am. So I'm going to let them think again, and I'll just jump off the cuff here with something. But I think what this raises for me a little bit is this idea that I think has been so prevalent, especially in elementary education, when it comes to environmental education, that what we don't want to sort of overwhelm kids, right? And I think that there's this whole narrative of privilege, that has really never been properly examined when we talk about like how early is too early, right, to talk about the climate crisis. And there are that's a complicated conversation, but and I think that's often balanced with this like, okay, so we need to focus on recycling and composting and kind of these things that are tangible and we can wrap our hands around. And I think that while it's never an either or thing, right, that absolutely always get kids engaged in those things that they can wrap their hands around. It also, I really appreciated what Ramon was saying about using our imaginations. And so I think one way that we can kind of move beyond this idea, that we're going to recycle and sort of buy green, our way out of this crisis is to ask kids. And I think elementary school kids are very capable of doing this too, to imagine beyond that really limited response, right, to a much deeper, more transformational response, and I think with a few strategies and tools that kids are really capable of doing this, and just and engaging that kind of almost like you were saying, Ramon, like mythological sort of thinking, and really inspiring one another in that way. And I've taken in my environmental justice class the last couple of years, doing a few months into the year, doing an Imagining 2040 writing assignment where kids and kids are they're doing, and they can write poetry, they can tell a story, it can be personal narrative, but those are powerful days when we come in and we circle up and just go through and read these imaginations of the future. And it can be really healing, I think, too, in the midst of courses that, like Clint was saying, can feel way too heavy sometimes. But so anyway, that's one thing that I was thinking about and I wanted to offer.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment, Tim, and that picture of the kids in a circle and sharing, engaging in science fiction might be one way to say it, or speculative fiction. And I think also too, I brought this word ritual into the conversation, and in a public school setting, that's a no-no. That's asking for it. And so I think one of the things we have to, I'll go ahead and say that you got to cloak things sometimes. And the cloak is this, the ritual can be very simple. That standing in a circle and just sharing, that has the subconscious structure of ritual. You don't have to call it anything. It doesn't have to be of this denomination or that culture. It's just there's some basic forms that people can engage that can do that. And then another thing along the kind of line of myth and ritual is, Michael Meade, the guy who I quoted at the beginning, he wrote a book about 10 years ago. I think it was called The World Beyond the World. And he was basically sharing stories from around the world about people who, or times when the world looked as if it was going to end. And instead of getting Hercules or Krishna or Sundiata or like all the great, like massive heroes, he was looking at like the little, like the people who just carried a sack of gold from one city to another. And like, they did the little thing that just helped the world take the next step. You know, so one thing that the moral there is, if you were going to use stories as a way to help support taking little actions and big contribution, is find the smaller stories. Find the stories that are more relatable, the stories that don't require that you know, you don't have to die for everybody, you know, just but you do your thing and you show some bravery somewhere, and it can switch things up.
Yeah, you just made me think, Ramon, about, you know, a lot of the stories of that we have in our you know, Cherokee cultures focuses on the underdog, so to speak, like you're mentioning, and I think that is probably a human way of communicating that very thing that you just said. You know, look at what this little being, seemingly insignificant, did, and what are the lessons we can glean from that. But yeah, I'm also inspired by both of you, and Tim. You know, for me, my mind always goes back to education, and it's not because I'm an educator in at a university, but like it's because of the field that I teach in is so underrepresented in primary schools, and you know, it's I get students who are saying, why didn't we get this before? And so that, you know, I think that's changing more and more, and it's inspiring to hear about your students and what they're doing and what you're covering in your class and how you're taking them out of the classroom. But also, you know, this relates to what Ramon just said, you know, being able to tell stories of center stories of activism, so that folks can see themselves, young people can see themselves in that role, or at least see that change does not require like you said, Ramon, the Herculean efforts, or, you know, some kind of otherworldly power to enact.
Well, I'm looking and seeing that we're at time right now. So I guess I'll just end with, if anyone has any kind of final parting thoughts before we go.
Well, I'm going to be Tim this time and say to these three, not two, but these three, that thank you very, very much. Your contributions and your presence has just been so helpful, but that doesn't get you off the hook of some, I mean, you don't have to, but some type of final thought. If you have it, it would be wonderful to hear.
Well, I'll mix the order up, not make Tim go first. One thing, I want to invite folks to a workshop that my wife and I are conducting in the, you know, in-person portion of the work, or this conference. And we're actually going to be working with some of Joanna Macy's work that reconnects. And the idea is that, like, even as educators, we are carrying a big burden, having to impart this stuff and support students. And it's a lot, you know? So the workshop is actually a space for y'all to come in and like lay down some of your burdens. And in the act of doing that, you can start to learn a practice for how to hold space for your students in a similar way. So if folks are interested, that's on Sunday. It's in one of the morning sessions. I'm forgetting right now. And otherwise, I'm wishing y'all good luck, and maybe everybody take a deep breath wherever you are. And yeah, keep doing what you do.
Ramon, I really wish I could come. You know, it just reminds me that a couple weeks ago, you know, teachers were coming back and we were kind of talking about what we were looking forward to, what felt sort of like a challenge, and I didn't anticipate it. I just broke into tears, like talking to some colleagues that I knew, saying, I am, I've been doing this for a long time, but I'm really worried that I'm not going to be able to show up for my students in the way that they need me to, in this moment of compounding crises, and so I really appreciate what you're saying, and I think that what we all have to remember is that that this is just this is tremendous, like tremendously important work that we do, and I mean, that's the gift of teaching, and that you often don't even know the small ways and big ways that we're impacting the students that we get a chance to interact with, and it might come back years later, but just being there and engaging in these conversations and kind of being there alongside them, I think is a really important piece of what we have to do right now. So best wishes to everybody, and just keep up the good work.
And I'll just jump in there. Thank you, Tim and Ramon. I'll just resonate with you both and say, in very brief response to some of the Q&A and the comments here, but reacting to Ramon about the what's on our shoulders in doing this work. And then the question here from Anna Michael, how do we begin those conversations and encouraging activism engagement in the classroom without students feeling like it's another adult telling them what to do, or another adult trying to shape their thoughts? And my mind just immediately goes back to kind of what Ramon was saying, is how do we sit with the responsibility that this is, but then it's also about relationships. I definitely think on a regular basis, what can I do in my own life? And somebody mentioned in the chat, their garden, and that to me is like, okay, this is enacting in some small way what I teach in my classroom, and how can I model that, but then also how can I develop a relationship that's outside of that authoritative space of the teacher and the hierarchy that the Western educational model instills in us. And even breaking out of the classroom is a hope of mine, and getting more land-based work, not just through the program in Oklahoma, but through my courses at CU Boulder. So, I think about relationship. How do you craft, meaningful relationships with your students to where they don't see you as an authoritative figure, but more as a fellow human trying to navigate this crazy world with everyone else. So thank you all. Yeah.
Well, thanks again, Clint, Ramon, and Tim. Those were wonderful talks and conversation. And thank you, Kim and Anna, for your help running the webinar. And thank you to all the educators and researchers who joined us tonight. Thanks, everyone, and take care.
Good night.
Take care, y'all.